Immigration Minister Chris Bowen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kieran.
The move to excise the entire Australian mainland was put to caucus today, passed caucus. When will that be put to the Parliament?
Tomorrow I'll introduce the legislation, and what this does is remove what would be a very perverse incentive for people to continue on boats to try and miss Christmas Island or Ashmore Reef, to try and make the mainland, to stop them being processed in another country. Now, we're trying to save people's lives here, so it has no logical basis to say, well, look, if you make it to Christmas Island or Ashmore Reef, you run the risk of being transferred to Nauru or PNG, but if you make it to the Australian mainland, you'll be okay. You can't be processed offshore. It would be a perverse incentive in place, and so that's why we're introducing this legislation, which is, of course, a recommendation of the Houston panel.
But how many boats have arrived on the Australian mainland? It's barely a handful, isn't it? How many over the last decade?
Well, of course, up until recently, there's been little incentive to try and make it to the mainland because the arrangements have been broadly similar. There have been some differences, but not the prospect of being transferred to a different country. We have seen around 1,500 people either get close to the mainland or make the mainland over the past 4 or so years. About 200 have actually not been regarded as what's called offshore entry people under the Immigration Act. But what you can't have is a situation where people smugglers would say, well, before it didn't really matter. All we needed to do was get you to Christmas Island. We'll get us on the boat another couple of days and we'll get you to the Australian mainland. You know, that's 3 more days of risk, of tragedy, of people drowning at sea, and we're just not prepared to take that risk.
But you would concede, though, that this is a very small percentage of the overall problem at the moment, isn't it? And what do you say to suggestions that this is just posturing by the government to look tough?
Well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, we are implementing a recommendation of an expert panel, and we are removing any opportunity for people smugglers to go out there and spin and say, it's okay, I can get you to the mainland, so you won't be sent to Nauru or PNG.
But when you look at the vast majority of arrivals,
absolutely.
This is only a small percentage,
absolutely it is, and I've never said otherwise, Kieran, never suggested otherwise, but we do need to close down any opportunity for people smugglers to spin and tell their lies, as I know they do.
So this isn't just more symbolic than the realities, a symbolic message to the asylum seekers, the would-be asylum seekers that don't try Australia because we're even excising the mainland.
No, it's a very substantial message to say it doesn't matter what part of Australia you get to, you'll be subject to processing overseas. It's a significant message, yes. Nobody's pretending that the majority of asylum seekers have made it to the Australian mainland. Of course they haven't. But we saw under the Howard government people attempting to get to the mainland, and I would be concerned if we didn't close down this potential difference of approach. You would see people smugglers trying to change their behaviour, keeping people on boats for longer to try and get to the mainland. This is the only responsible thing to do.
But there are concerns. There are concerns in your caucus. We've been advised today by the caucus spokesman that there were 2 questions to you, individual MPs with concerns as to whether or not this move is within international guidelines. It might have been proposed by Angus Houston, but what was your message to them? Is it within international guidelines?
Yes, it is. This is completely consistent with our international obligations, particularly our signature to the Refugee Convention. Completely consistent. Our advice is very clear on that. Now, of course, people have questions, but I've got to say, Kieran, I've been involved in a few robust caucus debates over the years. While I'm not going to go into details, this wouldn't count as one of them.
But there are some on the left who aren't happy with yet another tough measure in this area.
These are difficult issues. You'll always find people with reservations, but the caucus was very, very clear in their support of my position today.
You would have found it hard to believe, though, in the years when the Howard government tried to implement the very same policy, they were precluded from doing that by Labor and some of their own moderates, Judy Moylan, Russell Broadbent, Petro Georgiou, and others, and now Labor's come full circle and implementing the Howard government policy.
Well, this just shows what we're prepared to do at our own political cost in some instances to try and get this issue fixed, to save lives and to get a fairer system for bringing asylum seekers to Australia. This is part of an entirely integrated package. all the recommendations of the Houston panel, the increase in the refugee intake to 20,000. I mean, something which many people in the progressive side of politics have been calling for years, we've done. Just last week from refugee camps in Lebanon, I announced the breakdown of that 20,000, the allocation of the places to give people in very difficult circumstances around the world the chance of resettlement in Australia. People have been in refugee camps for years. People have been in refugee camps in some instances for 30 years, waiting for resettlement.
Would you expect support for the coalition on this excision?
I would expect support from the coalition on this matter.
Have you had any indication along those lines?
I had an initial discussion with Mr Morrison some time ago. I wouldn't overstate the level of detail there. It was an initial discussion, but clearly the first process was for me, as is normal, to take this matter through the caucus, to get caucus approval for this. Then, of course, we provide briefings to anybody interested, including the opposition.
On another issue, Nauruans, this is in the Australian newspaper today, recruited to work at the detention centre, the reopened detention centre, are being paid as little as $4 an hour. Is that appropriate?
Well, let's be clear about this. This has been of, frankly, substantial benefit to the Nauruan people and economy. This is a small island, population under 10,000, unemployment very high. I met some Nauruans employed at our centre, and I asked them, how long has it been since you had a job? And they looked at me a bit blankly, because it was the first job they'd ever had. This is a very substantial boost to the Nauruan
But the paper
economy.
points out that the Prime Minister just recently had a crack at Gina Reinhardt for talking about those in Africa working at $2 a day. $4 an hour is not much better, is it?
Well, our requirement of our contractors, including Transfield Services, is that they comply with existing conditions and standards. And I understand they're doing that. Now, yes, wages on Nauru are lower than wages in Australia. I've seen somebody from Nauru point out that public servants in Nauru get paid a lower amount of money. We require Transfield Services and our other contractors to meet local standards and conditions. But I will say this, we've employed 70 locals on the Nauru detention facility, on the facility at Nauru. That's just 70 direct employees. Then you've got all the flow-on impacts for the Nauruan economy and giving people a chance to get work and to get experience working in a different environment. And it's been a good thing for Nauru.
What's the latest you've got on the protest? We've seen claims of people taking on or attempted suicide, other cases of self-harm. How prevalent is that?
Well, we have had some instances of self-harm on Nauru, as we've said. We have seen some protests, peaceful protests by and large. These are people in a very difficult circumstance. I've been and spoken to them about their circumstances. I've faced them and said, this is the situation and this is why Australia is implementing this policy.
Do we just have to get used to it? Suicide attempts, self-harm, that's the norm?
They would much rather be processed in Australia. Of course they would. But this is all necessary in order to avoid not one or two people, drowning at sea, but to avoid the mass tragedies that we've seen. Now, we have
self-harm, suicide attempts. That's just the norm.
Of course, it's not. Of course, we do everything we can to assist. We've provided substantial mental health support. We have professionals on the island, on Nauru, providing that assistance. But of course, we're in a difficult situation. They're in a difficult situation, and you do get tensions, and you do get people who are upset about them having paid money to a people smuggler to get to Australia, and them not getting what they paid for. And it is a message which I would recognise is a tough one, to say that we're implementing the no advantage test and that people won't receive a visa until they would have if they'd waited in a detention facility or a camp somewhere else in the world. There are 43 million displaced people in very difficult circumstances around the world, all of whom, I would suggest, would love the chance of resettlement in Australia.
And finally, I want to ask you, as a Cabinet Minister, your view on this case in South Australia where Don Farrell, a senator, stood aside from the #1 spot on the Senate ticket to allow Penny Wong to take the #1 spot. Don Farrell, a former union boss, a power broker in South Australia. It's absurd that it got to this situation, isn't it? Well, Labor needs to look at the way it deals with these things, to have one of the best performers like Penny Wong relegated to #2, albeit now in the #1 spot.
Well, Don Farrell's done the right thing here. He should be congratulated for it. He's recognised the broader interests of the party would be best served by having one of our best communicators and a senior cabinet minister in the #1 spot. We do have pre-selection issues from time to time, whether it be in South Australia or New South Wales, and I've got some things on the public record. I've said before about party reform, but the important thing here is that Don Farrell has, I think, put the party first. I'm confident that he'd be elected as a senator from the #2 spot, but it is important and appropriate that our very senior cabinet colleague Penny Wong lead the Senate ticket in South Australia.
Chris Bowen, thanks for your time.
Thank you.